Zealand Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. The friendly land of milk and honey, Edmund's cookbooks, pavlova desserts, the famous Buzzy Bee toy, long hot summers, and of course, Selwyn Too Good on TV. Oh yes, we had our own cartoon heroes at Footrot Flats, beautiful beaches, beach jandals, and comedy icons who captured New Zealand humour so well, like Fred Dagg.
If you don't mind.
Oh, by all means, Lindsay.
Some viewers may not be aware of what your official position actually is at the moment. Could you tell us that?
Oh, certainly, yes. I am the New Zealand High Commissioner to Taihape and, of course, the Ambassador Extraordinary and in plenipotentiary capacity to the Court of St Brian's and Barrowlands and Trevor at Te Awamutu.
We valued the proud Māori culture, the All Blacks, the haka, and comedian Billy T. James, who put it all into perspective.
Oh, tēnā koutou. Last night up north, somebody stole a toilet seat out of the Kaikohe police station. Well, the cops got nothing to go on.
There were classic TV ads, which portrayed the typical Kiwi male farmer back when it was safe to be one.
Ooh, bugger. You bird.
Bugger.
Bugger.
Oh, we had it all, famous Kiwi lollies and candy, the LMP bottle, and at the end of the day, the goodnight Kiwi to tell us it was time for bed. Yes, New Zealand was the land of happy people, good people, famous for our freedoms and free thinking. But after the 2017 election, we entered a new era. We found ourselves with a new Labour-led government and a Prime Minister who said her government would be kind, open, empathetic, and that she wanted kindness in New Zealand. She was widely admired and loved for this, the most popular Prime Minister in years.
But if you start looking at a lens of politics through what we like to use, kindness, empathy, well-being, and try and build trust back into our institutions again, no matter where we are.
And it is this: kindness, kindness and collectivism, empathetic, strong and kind.
We teach kindness and empathy and compassion, and I'm very proudly an empathetic, compassionately driven politician.
But something went wrong. Very wrong. New Zealand became a country at war with itself, and ordinary Kiwis from all walks of life were involved. But why were passive people suddenly fighting? For what? Or against what? The Prime Minister said,
"Be kind. I know people will want to act as enforcers, and I understand that people are afraid and they are anxious, but we will play the role of enforcer."
Some in the crowd claimed police brutality, pointing to officers punching protesters.
Even the trusted New Zealand police were weaponised against the people.
What I have seen myself, I am very happy with.
And we saw the tragic consequences of an indifferent government to its fearful and angry people. We saw police brutality. We saw women violently handled by police in public, degraded and dehumanised as we had never seen before. Even elderly non-violent men were beaten into unconscious submission. All this while politicians said they felt for the people,
and we feel for those people,
yet degraded them.
Madam Speaker, there is a river of filth.
Yet the pleas continue.
Our forefathers have fought for this land, and you don't ride roughshod over it.
And still the Prime Minister tried to portray a government that was for its people.
Every New Zealander has a right to protest.
But their actions told a different story. It was no longer safe to question the government.
It will be our job to try and understand how a group of people could succumb to such wild and dangerous mis- and disinformation. true measure of leadership is the ability to confront the anxiety of the people of their time. That is the measure of a leader.
But I also want this government to feel different. I want people to feel that it's open, that it's listening, and that it's going to bring kindness back.
Arden would one day be haunted by these words. Yes, New Zealand felt very different. The government had changed the country forever. Out of 120 members of Parliament, not one politician was prepared to hear from the people why they were frightened and angry. Not one. How could this free and lovely country change like this? What was the cause of this trouble? A man previously unknown to the world appeared on the world screens, telling us that COVID-19 had arrived and that it was a pandemic.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
Then one by one, the world's leaders announced the emergency.
Today I am officially declaring a national emergency.
We must therefore go into a national lockdown, which is tough enough.
The world's media immediately and hysterically sounded the alarm.
It has to do with COVID-19, and the World Health Organization has just declared a global coronavirus. It is a pandemic.
The World Health Organization has declared coronavirus a global pandemic.
The world was on fire with COVID, and we were saturated with COVID-19 death fear messaging. The images were terrifying and compelling. Images of COVID death filled the internet and media channels. The New Zealand government relished in the narrative of COVID death and gave itself unprecedented powers.
Today, a state of national emergency has been declared across New Zealand. Through the early and hard measures we've taken at the border using the powers under the Health Act, the signing of epidemic notices, and now being in a state of national emergency, we have all of the legislative means possible, all of the enforcement powers, all the tools we need at our disposal to combat the spread of COVID-19.
And then, without one confirmed case of community transmission of COVID-19, New Zealand was placed into a national state of emergency.
The government has declared a national state of emergency due to the threat from COVID-19, giving police and other state agencies sweeping powers to enforce lockdown.
In March 2020, while everyone was sleeping, the government introduced the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act 2020, and it soon became law. This legislation was the single most draconian law ever introduced in New Zealand.
These decisions will place the most significant restrictions on New Zealanders' movements in modern history.
With scenes resembling Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia, we saw police monitoring and restricting the movement of healthy people. And then we saw the unthinkable, the New Zealand military used in enforcement roles. Let's see how a current member of Parliament describes this law.
The government has just passed the COVID-19 Public Health Response Bill. This is one of the most extreme pieces of legislation to ever be passed through our Parliament. We all want to see the end of COVID-19 and we all want to unite in the fight against it. But we also want to protect our freedoms that we have as New Zealanders, and we want to protect our democracy. This bill goes against that. What this bill does is it allows the government the ability to limit the number of people who can go to tangis, funerals, weddings and church services, which we've seen them do over the last few days. It also gives extreme powers for enforcement officers to enter premises and close them down, and it gives the police the ability to enter your home without a warrant to ensure that you aren't breaking any of the rules. It's an extreme piece of legislation and it will be in place for up to 2 years. National did not support this, and I'm proud that I didn't support it either.
Civil Defence Emergency Management Director Sarah Stewart-Black has told a media conference the country was put under a state of emergency at 12:21 this afternoon, ahead of the move to Alert Level 4 tonight at 1 minute to midnight.
The state of national emergency has been declared because of the unprecedented nature of this global pandemic and to ensure the government has all the powers it needs to slow the spread of COVID-19 and reduce its impact.
Cabinet met this morning to discuss our next actions in the fight against COVID-19. We will move to level 4.
And then they did the unthinkable and unprecedented. They locked down an entire country of healthy New Zealanders in alert level 4 and closed our society down because of a deadly virus. Literally overnight, New Zealand cities and towns across our country resembled ghost towns of some kind of dystopian movie. Businesses were destroyed and lives and livelihoods were damaged and lost. And the beginning of division and harm New Zealand had never seen, not even during world wars. New Zealanders panicked and brought weeks of food and rolls of toilet paper. This was it. If we caught COVID-19, we could all die. Kia ora and greetings. My name is Billy Takahika, and I'm a civil and human rights activist here in New Zealand. And I've been fighting for truth and freedom for over 3.5 years. I'm a pastor and former member of the New Zealand Army and Police, and have been a community contributor for many years. I'm also a former international blues guitarist. Since the COVID-19 issue arrived in New Zealand in early 2020, I believe the people of our great country have been subjected to tyranny and mass manipulation of the kind we have never seen before. I believe that the harm caused by the government's response to COVID-19 has been immeasurable, while the government maintains its claims that it was all justified by honest, true, and accurate medical science. In this documentary, we have tested those claims made by the government, and from the behaviours and the evidence we will present to you, you will be able to assess if the government has been honest and justified by their actions. We've looked at who and what organisations have been involved with the New Zealand government's COVID response to establish what influences, if any, have helped shape their COVID policies. We've also examined the way the New Zealand government has treated those people who have spoken up with concerns about their COVID-19 narrative. We've also checked to see if there has been a targeted campaign to slander these people, as well as to manipulate the public through mainstream media. Across 3 documentary episodes, you will travel with me across New Zealand to hear the stories of those Kiwis affected by the New Zealand government's COVID-19 response. I want to be perfectly clear about something. This documentary is not about revenge or rabbit holes or conspiracy theories. It is about honest data, expert and witness testimony. Our goal is not to tell you what or how to think, but rather we want you to think for yourself and do your own research. Welcome to episode 1 of The River of Lies, the New Zealand Scamdemic. In March 2020, the New Zealand government announced the COVID-19 national emergency, and they launched a propaganda campaign that told us all that COVID-19 was the deadliest disease ever to threaten our way of life and our very lives. To get to this point, they relied heavily on the projection modellings of the Imperial College London and those of New Zealand physicist Professor Sean Hendy of Auckland University. Yes, you heard correctly. Hendy was a physicist without any medical or public health training, and yet he would become the COVID modelling expert who would play a crucial role in the New Zealand government's response to COVID-19. Let's examine what these experts have to say about COVID-19 and see how it measures up against the actual and true science. Could COVID-19 really kill everyone? So let's talk quickly about a couple of terms you are going to hear, such as infection fatality rates, or IFRs. In common language, an IFR is your likelihood of dying once infected with COVID-19. The other term is CFR, or case fatality rate, which is the percentage of known cases of COVID-19 that cause the patient to die. Professor Neil Ferguson and the Imperial College in London provided the WHO and world governments the data modellings that told the whole world that COVID-19 was the deadliest disease since the Spanish flu. Ferguson told the UK government that they could expect 100,000 cases per day and up to 500,000 deaths from COVID. He also told the US government they could expect up to 2.2 million deaths over the next few months to a year. This was terrifying news. a suggested IFR of well over 3%. And then came Professor Sean Hendy of Auckland University. Now remember, he is a physicist who seemed to have picked up a similar data modelling approach to figuring out potential COVID deaths in New Zealand. This was a major problem, as along with those of the Imperial College, Sean Hendy's projections continued the story of COVID-19 death fear without the science. Other scientists, such as Auckland University microbiologist Susie Wiles and Otago University epidemiologist Michael Baker, supported both Hendy's models and the government's approach to dealing with COVID. Wiles had no previous public health experience, yet along with Baker and Hendy, as government advisors, would become stars of the COVID media world. So New Zealand media broadcast the message of Hendy everywhere. It was non-stop, night and day. They even showed Anthony Fauci announcements and the horrific footage of people dying in the streets, which kept the hysteria rolling along. But when it became apparent that the 80,000 deaths model was a failure, they quickly amended the message to say that 7,000 people would die in a year, even with a vaccine rate of 75%, a lot lower than 80,000, but still terrifying. And then the government really ramped things up with their COVID messaging campaign. They started the daily COVID-19 briefings.
Welcome to the COVID-19 media update today. Welcome to today's media update. Today we have 18 new cases of COVID-19. Welcome back to the Ministry of Health. As you heard from our 1 o'clock release, we have had 2 cases.
Day after day at 1 p.m, New Zealanders were hearing the same message of doom and gloom and fear and death. And the government drove home that message that tens of thousands of us could die if we didn't listen to their advice, and they were so convincing.
If community transmission takes off in New Zealand, the number of cases will double every 5 days. If that happens unchecked, our health system will be inundated, and tens of thousands of New Zealanders will die.
We don't want thousands of people to die. It is that plain and simple.
So we were completely saturated with messaging of COVID death and fear, and there was no escaping it. People would just have to do what we were told to beat this disease. But were these messages based on evidence and solid medical advice? Or were we being fed something else?
We drum in that messaging around the dangers of COVID pretty diligently for a full 2-week period of sustained propaganda.
Arden just said it. She uses sustained propaganda to terrorise the people of New Zealand about COVID-19. Here is an interesting and I believe appropriate quote from Adolf Hitler, who wrote the book and masterclass about how to misinform people through propaganda. And Hitler says this: propaganda must not investigate the truth objectively, and insofar as it is favourable to the other side, present it according to the theoretical rules of justice. Yet it must only present that aspect of the truth which is favourable to its own side. The receptive powers of the masses are very restricted and their understanding is feeble. Quote Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. So let's take a look at the meaning and definition of the word propaganda, and let's start with the Oxford English Dictionary that says the systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way. American Dictionary says by not giving all of the facts or by secretly emphasizing only one way of looking at the facts. And finally, Britannica Dictionary, and here's what it has to say: ideas or statements that are often false, exaggerated, and that are spread in order to help a cause. We will look at the propaganda issue throughout this documentary and focus on it in an upcoming episode. We will see if the propaganda tactics as used by the Nazi regime have also been used by the Arden government and the global proponents of the COVID-19 narrative to manipulate people into accepting their message. And we will see if they say and mean that they are the single source of truth, just like Hitler did.
We will continue to be your single source of truth unless you hear it from us. It is not the truth.
However, some people were not convinced by the government's propaganda and were only interested in the truth. Okay, so let's see what other experts have to say about the infection fatality rate and risk of COVID-19. and let's also see what they have to say about the government's approach. Simon Thornley is a New Zealand medical doctor and academic, specialising in epidemiology, public health and biostatistics. He is a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland, and he had assessed Imperial College's predictions and the government's response to COVID-19, and took the brave step of telling the world that the New Zealand government had got it wrong. Let's see what he has to say about the modelling and COVID.
COVID-19 is a nasty flu-like virus. It's new, but it's not unique. The Ioannidis study shows the death rate is only very marginally worse than the standard flu viruses that kill hundreds of sick and elderly New Zealanders every year. The response should be a measured one, like we've planned for lower mortality pandemics, not lockdowns. We've sacrificed our humanity, our society, and our economy for the wrong virus. The fear and panic that has driven the response of many scientists, politicians, policymakers, and the media, we believe, is unwarranted, and it's even irrational.
So these modelling projections were totally exaggerated. There wasn't the raw data that they were based on. It just wasn't out at the time, and they were wild predictions, and they were proved to be so. And the curious thing is that we're still stuck with a lot of these people advising the government. How come?
We believe now that our current policy is many, many more times more problematic than the actual virus itself.
And I'm here to tell you there has never been a pandemic of severe respiratory infectious disease, and immunologically they are impossible. The reason there hasn't been one, but just lies, is because diseases that are severe make you ill quickly. When you're ill, you withdraw from community circulation, you stop transmitting, and the thing goes quiescent. So if they tell you something like, oh, it's another flu, but this time it's as lethal as Ebola, you must know they're lying, that it's not possible for a severe infection like that to spread like wildfire, because as soon as you get ill, you withdraw involuntarily. You don't need to be locked down. And so the thing turns off. If it wasn't like that, humans would have been wiped out repeatedly. Other animals would have been wiped out repeatedly by this simple vulnerability.
Even at the height of this epidemic, the ICUs were comparatively empty. New Zealand's response was appropriate for a more severe virus, one that we thought that we had when we had the early data.
In 2020, the New Zealand government said it had to protect New Zealanders, and that if they didn't protect New Zealanders from COVID-19, that we would have up to 80,000 deaths in New Zealand if we didn't lock New Zealand down. Now, to do that, they had to create the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act 2020, which is the most draconian act we've ever seen in New Zealand. They promised they would let that authority go once it was proven that we were safe again. Amy, we've had nowhere near 80,000 deaths. They've not let that authority go. They've strengthened it. What does that indicate to you?
That it was a hoax all along. Oops, we got the models wrong. Some of these models came out of Imperial College London. They did their modeling. The academics and the academic scientists did their modeling. Look, for the lockdowns, you only have to look at the Great Barrington Declaration, which came out very early, containing dissenting scientific views about the necessity of lockdowns. So there was opposition from the very get-go, but that was censored and demonized. These models were deeply problematic from the very beginning, and there were many experts who were censored when they tried to explain why and how. Now I imagine the government will be coming out saying, we were trying our best, we did it with the best intention, oops, maybe they weren't so useful, the lockdowns, but we were well motivated. That's belied by the fact that they would not allow dissenting views and that they censored dissenting views and tried to demonize scientists like Simon Thornley at the University of Auckland. So that won't wash.
Iceland is a particularly good example. So they've done widespread testing, but they've readjusted the risk of the virus. They're starting to open up their borders. They're allowing tourism. They're not locking down. So I think if you look to Europe now, you see that many countries are adjusting their risk to the virus. Well, you look at the epidemic curves and you'll see that the death rates have come right down now. And if you look at the deaths overall, you'll see that the deaths in each country are in age groups that are about the same as what we expect for natural mortality.
You are an epidemiologist. Have you personally published work on communicable diseases?
Yes, I certainly have. I've been working in public health on the measles outbreak. I've been doing models of infectious diseases. So if I can't speak out on this issue, I'm not sure who can, Jack.
We now bring into the picture the world's leading epidemiologist, Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford University, and hear his views. His expertise is so highly thought of that even the World Health Organization had to publish his findings, despite them contradicting what they and the Imperial College were saying.
The infection fatality rate for this new coronavirus is likely to be in the same ballpark as seasonal influenza. Clearly very different compared to the original thoughts or speculations or preliminary data that suggested a much, much higher infection fatality rate. We also try to estimate what is the absolute risk if you're less than 65. And we try to compare that against the risk of dying if you drive your car over a given distance. In doing this, we try to correct for the number of days that the pandemic is ongoing, so you can get an estimate per day. In many locations like Germany, the risk of dying from coronavirus until we did the analysis on April 4 is in the range of the risk of dying driving from home to work or even less. What's the current status of the pandemic? We have 180 million documented cases globally. Close to 4 million deaths is about 0.05% of the global population has died so far. We have tried to make forecasting to try to deal with this major problem. Some of the best minds in the world, some of the best trained data scientists did their best, and they failed. Much of that research had low quality. There's a number of empirical evaluations done by multiple teams that showed that the quality of much of that research done in haste and very quickly and with cutting corners much of the time was very low quality and therefore substantially misleading in some important situations. Why would forecasting models fail? There's many reasons for that. This is one early example that we tried to look at what happened in New York during the first wave. We published that work in the European Journal of Epidemiology. And basically, we saw that some very basic tenets of running models were not there. For example, even the number of deaths, there were different sources from respectable venues that gave different numbers of deaths for each day during that first wave. So obviously, a model that is trained on data that are not reliable and there's inconsistency may not do very well.
Here is the Ioannidis report that remarkably the WHO published, and it clearly shows that what the Imperial College, WHO, and most of the world governments were telling the public about COVID was simply untrue. Did Professor Ioannidis unwittingly sink a narrative and agenda of untruth and expose a river of lies? So despite the warnings of Professor John Ioannidis, Professor Simon Thornley, and countless other scientists, doctors and epidemiologists, the WHO, medical organisations and the New Zealand government accepted the failed modelling of the Imperial College London and seemingly without due diligence took the projections of Professor Neil Ferguson at face value, leading to possibly the greatest disaster since World War II. Governments and the WHO should have known that Neil Ferguson was infamous for blowing out, exaggerated and horribly wrong predictions and modelling. Let's look at his history. In 2002, Ferguson predicted that between 50 and 50,000 people would likely die from exposure to BSE or mad cow disease in beef. He also predicted that number could rise to 150,000 if there was a sheep epidemic as well. In the UK, there have actually been 177 deaths from BSE. In 2005, Ferguson said that up to 200 million people could be killed from the bird flu. In 2009, Ferguson and his Imperial team predicted that swine flu had a case fatality rate of 0.3% to 1.5%. Ferguson's advice said a reasonable worst-case scenario was that the disease would lead to 65,000 UK deaths. In the end, swine flu killed 457 people. On the 22nd of March 2020, Ferguson said that Imperial College London's model of COVID-19 disease was based on an undocumented 13-year-old computer code, yes, you heard that correct, intended to be used for a Fed influenza pandemic rather than a coronavirus. In 2020, Ferguson had made the most outrageous and dangerous claims of all, estimating that the global population faced mass death. The world, including the UN, WHO, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, seized on this information and ran with the narrative. This then was the scientist and the trusted academic college that made these incredible mistakes and claims, and the New Zealand government and those of the world in lockstep accepted his recommendations. But why did they accept these projections without intensely questioning them? It now seems that Sean Hendy followed a similar approach to Neil Ferguson without the necessary data, resulting in false projections that had no basis in fact or reasonable science. It also appears Hendy had made the same type of gross errors as Ferguson, yet instead of fronting up to it, he doubled down. But it soon became apparent that his modelling had failed in every way, including the outrageous claim that New Zealand had beaten COVID. Hendy had delivered the greatest example of scientific failure New Zealand had ever seen. Yet he became the expert that media and government would go to for information about what to do next. Despite his failed modelling, Hendy would receive government recognition and, along with Wiles and Baker, would be a trusted darling of medical science and media. Yet Wiles was a lab biologist with no clinical medical or epidemiological training, and these scientists, despite their apparent collective failed advice, would become what I would call the untouchables, protected by both government and media from criticism and accountability. But even worse than these unelected, inaccurate scientists acting out what looks like a script based on misinformation was the readiness of the New Zealand Labour government to accept it all, and then impose draconian measures on the populace to combat COVID-19. These responses to COVID would become more authoritarian and less about true and honest science. Let's give the last word to Professor Simon Thornley about the reality of COVID.
I was just going to something that I think is quite important from this particular plot here, which was kind of reassuring. I was trying to figure out how bad COVID was. And so what I did was look at background deaths, and I was given some data in 2019 when allegedly there's no COVID, and that's the age distribution of deaths in New Zealand during that time in the era of no COVID. So that's the black. And then I superimposed on that the COVID deaths, and I could only get into the nearest 10 years because that's what was given in the papers. But when I plotted them together and did a statistical test, I found that there was absolutely no difference in the distribution of age at death with COVID and without. Virtually no one on the other side brings up that the average age of death with COVID in New Zealand is 82, which also happens to be our life expectancy. Half of us are dead by that age anyway.
We can now see that the New Zealand government had got it very wrong. But how did they get it so wrong and yet act as if they were and are beyond reproach? One has to ask these questions and consider them carefully. The government had said repeatedly that this disease for most people would only deliver mild symptoms or no symptoms at all, and in many cases you may not even know you have COVID-19.
The vast majority of people who will ever have COVID-19 will only experience mild to moderate symptoms.
They knew this up front and early, yet continued a hysterical campaign of fear. Why? If they had known this data early and that the disease would mostly affect the elderly and already unwell, why would they go on to lock down an entire country of healthy people? And lastly, if they knew this data early on in the pandemic and knew that the projection modelings had failed, why did they not amend their COVID-19 response strategy? So we have learned something valuable. The government cannot be trusted to give us accurate information. But what next? Next came the issue of face masks. The New Zealand government's and WHO's messaging about face mask wearing and COVID-19 was very confusing. They seemed to contradict themselves and seemingly well-established science on the issue. But let's look at what they originally said about face mask wearing. Let's start with what the WHO has said and get some clear perspective from them.
WHO only recommends the use of masks in specific cases. If you have cough, fever, and difficulty breathing, you should wear a mask and seek medical care. If you do not have these symptoms, you do not have to wear masks because there is no evidence that they protect people who are not sick.
Early on, they made it very clear that the science told us that masks were not effective for stopping the transmission of any disease. Good for stopping droplets from sneezing, but not for stopping bugs.
If you do not have any respiratory symptoms such as fever, cough, or runny nose, you do not need to wear a medical mask, like this one. Mask alone can give you a false feeling of protection and can even be a source of infection when not used correctly.
Then they commissioned the CDC to do a study on masks. Yet again, most masks available to the public were found to be virtually useless for protecting anyone from COVID. Then, the WHO released a statement that they did not recommend face masks. Now let's look at what the experts said, starting with our own Michael Baker.
Most over-the-counter options won't prevent people catching the virus.
They're not very effective. After all, the virus can be also infect you via your eyes. It basically likes to land on the mucous membranes and then from your eyes go down into your nose anyway. So I think people should not bother with face masks.
Is that when you go out in the cold air in the middle of the winter and you talk about I can see my breath, that's the aerosols that you're breathing out. That's the aerosol condensing in the air. You see a big plume and it doesn't just drop to the ground. I wear glasses, so when we breathe on, the lenses and fog them up, the moisture we're getting on there, that's the aerosol. Scientific studies before this pandemic have shown that low-cost masks, and when we're talking about surgical masks and the cloth masks we're wearing, these low-cost masks have pore sizes that range between 80 and 500 microns in size, so a huge range, right? The diameter of the virus is 1 micron. The largest possible small droplet that can comprise a typical aerosol and 2 viral particles is 62 microns in diameter. So I just want to put that in perspective. The smallest pore size is 80. So that means the largest droplet coated with the virus can pass right through. Now, air is always going to travel, the easiest way out. So most of the aerosol leaks out, going up above our nose. The other leak points are right at the cheeks here. What people say is, okay, there's leak points, but if I have a properly fitting mask, surely, what you said can't be true, right? So let me see if I can show you this. We've been told to use up to 3 masks. So I've got 1. So let me put on, here's 2 masks, here's 3, so I'll put on a 4th one. I don't know if I'll get the 5th one on. Okay, so I got 5 masks, they're 3-ply surgical masks, so 15 layers. I'm going to seal it around their mouth. If this is true, the aerosols have come through, then this should fog up. We'll see. Can you see how foggy? Yeah. Now watch this. I made a cross. Can you see my eyes through that cross? Yep. So there's so much moisture there that you can see. Look at that cross pattern. There's so much moisture there. So I'm not going to say any more. This is crazy.
One after another, medical professionals and politicians told us that masks were useless and could even make you sick.
There are things you can do to keep yourself safe. Wearing a mask, if you're someone from the general public, is not one of them.
In terms of wearing a mask, our advice is clear that wearing a mask if you don't have an infection really reduces the risk, almost not at all. So we do not advise that.
Anthony Fauci and Jacinda Ardern even communicated the message that face masks used by the public were not effective.
Now, when you see people and look at the films in China and South Korea, whatever, everybody's wearing a mask. Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. But it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is.
I see people wearing masks. Your views on masks? Is there any reason why masks are something that people should be using?
So for the general public, if you don't have symptoms, there's no need to wear a mask. The thing is, the virus can still get in through your eyes. So if somebody's going to sneeze on you, the mask will only protect your nose. It won't protect your eyes.
The UK and US governments had told us that masks were not effective, and Ashley Bloomfield, the Director General of Health, also said the message loud and clear. Face masks don't work.
Some of you may have heard the interview that Kim Hill did with virologist Chris Smith from Cambridge University. He was very clear on this. You can use a face mask if you like, but it is not really any protection.
Hi folks, I've asked the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jenny Harris, to come here to Downing Street. Tell us about the value of wearing face masks. You see face masks around the place. Is there any point to that?
If a healthcare professional hasn't advised you to wear a face mask, it's usually quite a bad idea. People tend to leave them on. They contaminate the face mask and then wipe it over something. So it's really not a good idea and doesn't help.
Indeed, I was on the phone this morning to a colleague in Hong Kong who's done the evidence review for the World Health Organization, and we're of the same mind that there is no evidence that general wearing of face masks by the public who are well affects the spread of the disease in our society.
When the evidence around the use of masks by the general public, especially outdoors, is extremely weak.
The message was on the media.
Face masks to protect themselves against the virus. As Justine Conway explains, experts fear incorrect use could lead to more infection.
Healthy West Australians are being warned against using face masks to protect themselves against coronavirus. A safety video is going viral, showing how ineffective some can be as the nation struggles with a surgical mask shortage.
But for the last word, let's take another look at the face mask study produced by the US Centre for Disease Control and Prevention. We could trust them. They knew what they were saying and doing. Masks don't and won't protect you.
But then they changed their minds. Now they wanted everybody to wear face masks. Using the excuse of evolving data, they turned their backs on trusted, established science about face mask wearing and its effectiveness to protect you against COVID-19.
Now, remarkably, the same people who told us the IFR infection fatality rate was deadly and that face masks don't work had an amazing change of heart and told us we now needed masks.
In light of evolving evidence, WHO advises that governments should encourage the general public to wear masks where there is widespread transmission and physical distancing is difficult, such as on public transport, in shops, or in other confined or crowded environments.
Governments announced the change.
As of Monday, the 15th of June, face coverings will become mandatory on public transport.
First and foremost, masks and face coverings will, from 11:59 p.m. Wednesday night, be mandatory for everyone in Melbourne and Mitchell Shire.
Chief Medical Advisor to the US President, Dr. Anthony Fauci, announced his change of heart.
Don't go in a crowd. Plan B, if you do, make sure you wear a mask. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask.
And the same New Zealand experts lost credibility and changed their minds.
Public Health Professor Michael Baker Morena, and wow.
New Zealanders, as we know, we're just not used to wearing these things.
No.
But they're actually a great precaution to have available, and that every New Zealander should have a mask at home and know how to use it and when to use it.
I think people should not bother with face masks.
On masks, why have you chosen not to mandate mask use,
At this
particularly
stage.
Auckland at this point?
Yeah.
And is it something that's still on the table? Could we still see mandated mask
Yes,
use?
we could still see mandated mask use. Is there any reason why masks are something that people should be using?
So for the general public, if you don't have symptoms, there's no need to wear a mask.
But actually, this is a homemade mask, which there are various patterns for on the internet or elsewhere. I've also had a lovely one sent by a member of the public, which has got the TARDIS on it, which is nice. It goes here over the ears, and you can use a face mask if you like, but it is not really any protection.
But now the word mandate was being used, and governments were starting to reveal their true nature. It was all totalitarian. And now problems began for ordinary people who either had mask exemptions or who knew the science or had accepted the early advice that masks don't work. So why wear them now?
Now there was a new cult in New Zealand, and it was called the mask wearing cult. And non-mask wearers were bullied and harassed everywhere in New Zealand because the government had changed its mind. Kindness was now a thing of the past.
All over the world, terrible scenes of people being arrested for not wearing masks showed us this was not about health, it was about control.
Police are under investigation over the handling of a confrontation with a woman caught without a mask. Video shows an officer holding the woman by the throat after she resisted arrest.
Get off of me!
Grabbed around the neck by police, a woman who wasn't wearing a mask.
Choking me!
The forceful manoeuvre during a scuffle yesterday in Collingwood as her boyfriend watched.
It's a man on a girl and you choked her. For what? For a mask? For not having a mask? Look how pathetic you are.
A mother who refused to wear a mask and show identification was also arrested. The ordeal captured on camera.
The powers that be had decided that people were going to comply no matter what, and no matter what the science actually said. New Zealand was not so kind either. Then a good friend of mine, a mother, was assaulted for many minutes by a store security guard. It must be noted that she had contacted the store ahead of her visit to make sure that her mask exemption would be recognised and accepted, and they said it would. The guard didn't get the memo. Look at how he treated her, a woman.
Outside. Get outside. Outside.
Don't touch me! Don't touch me!
Get outside.
What is wrong with you?
Get outside. Get outside, wait outside, sort it out outside here.
Okay, please speak to your manager.
But this happened all over New Zealand and the world.
I am not entering into a contract with you.
Yes, I understand that, but what is your name?
Am I under arrest?
No, I'm trying to ascertain what your name is.
Can I please get your name and badge number, please?
SBX
For the camera. Sorry? Say that again. And your name?
Huh?
And your name?
I just have to do my number. What is your name, man? Because at the moment you're in breach of the dangerous...
No one's given me a mask. Excuse me. If you give me a mask, I will put it on.
What I need is your name and address. Man.
Not consent. And I'm not entering into contract.
But why this sudden change? Were influence and politics involved? Was there another agenda behind it all?
It doesn't, let's say, make sense on the science. It doesn't make sense on the facts. And here's another absolutely fascinating fact. A few weeks ago, if you looked for papers, policy papers, research papers saying whether masks were a good idea, there were several announcements and papers, some of which have disappeared from their positions on the net, which were hostile to Muslims.
Yes.
And there was a statement by the World Health Organization, which was definitely against the wearing of muzzles. Now, a few weeks ago, the World Health Organization did a reverse ferret and changed its mind. And Deborah Cohen, of the medical correspondent Newsnight on the BBC, had an amazing scoop the other day. She actually discovered, and she put it to the WHO, that her contacts inside the World Health Organization had told her that the position of the WHO on muzzles had been changed because of political pressure, not because of medical reasons.
Many interventions used in healthcare have benefits, but they also may have harms associated with them. These harms should be studied as much as any benefits. Critics say the studies to measure the impact of face coverings on the spread of the virus don't necessarily look at the unintended effects on people and on society.
Another criticism is the evidence for masks is not high quality. It doesn't come from what are known as randomised control trials. These are considered the best form of evidence. The issue has divided colleagues in Professor Greenhalgh's department at Oxford University. Professor Carl Hennigan is based just down the corridor there. He says for drugs we expect clinical trials, but when it comes to interventions like masks, lower standards seem to be acceptable. He also cautions against reusing masks.
Unfortunately, when things feel right, when they're common sense, they still have the equal chance of harming you as opposed to benefiting you. And let's be clear, the high-quality trial evidence for cloth masks suggests they increase your rates of reinfection.
The debate is deeply political. Newsnight understands that the World Health Organization committee that reviewed the evidence for the use of face coverings in public didn't back them, but after political lobbying, the WHO now recommends them.
This medical and health sector study says it all. Masks do not prevent transmission. The lowest quality of evidence supports mask wearing. Thirdly, most of the population is at low risk from COVID-19, and children even lower. Contaminated masks are dangerous. The risks of using face masks far outweigh the benefits. And lastly, children are most at risk from mandates for masks.
So it was clear it had to be a political reason, not a health or medical one, that suddenly people were being told to wear a mask. It became a sign of compliance, a sign of fear, a sign of a loss of critical thinking. But why was the New Zealand government doing this to us? Surely only sick people needed masks.
In terms of putting the mask on, put the loops over your ears.
The New Zealand government had done it again. They created another policy that did not make sense, could not be backed up with science, and had made strange recommendations that seemed to be politically motivated.
You can use a face mask if you like, but it is not really any protection.
Hi, my name's Tony Andrews. I have a barber shop here in Whangarei. I'm providing a service for the customers, and I've been hammered by the government concerning enforcing mask wearing and wearing a mask myself. Because I didn't comply, they're taking me to court to face these charges of someone squealing that I didn't wear masks, I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. I haven't harmed anybody, I haven't injured any party, and no death has arisen from my conduct down here, which is to provide a service and provide for my family. It's just wrong what they're doing, and I hope that everybody's eyes are opened and come out of this tyrannical system that has been taking over our country. And so I just want to share that little short testimony concerning my plight.
It was now very clear. The message that the WHO and the governments had initially given us about face masks was correct. Face masks do not prevent transmission. And in fact, face masks actually increase your risk of being sick.
That's 2 from 2. Twice the government had provided reasons for COVID-19 rules that were not true. Next, we look at PCR testing and how the pandemic may have been created.
The PCR-based test, the test which you see every day of the swab being pushed up somebody's nose, the testing for that is usually based on identifying the coronavirus directly. Those tests have been distributed widely around the world and are probably the most accurate way to determine whether someone is currently infected. In other words, the virus is in their body.
So how did we end up with a global pandemic of COVID-19? It was through the COVID testing of global populations that the world was told that we were in a serious pandemic. But was the testing mechanism accurate and fit for purpose?
Right now, the majority of tests being used to diagnose COVID-19 are genetic tests known as PCR tests. These tests are very accurate because even if there's only a tiny amount of virus present in the patient sample, PCR, which stands for polymerase chain reaction, is able to take genetic material from the virus, target specific gene segments that only the virus has, and make a very large number of copies of those segments so that they can be detected and measured.
The PCR, or polymerase chain reaction test, was the method the New Zealand government would use to test for COVID-19. After the horrifying campaign of COVID fear, New Zealanders were desperate to know if they had COVID. For the first time ever in a pandemic, people were told they could have the disease and have no symptoms. Really? In essence, you could be sick with COVID and not even know it. This had never happened before in any pandemic or epidemic in human history. So, in their thousands, people flocked to testing stations. And lo and behold, as a result, COVID case numbers went up through the roof.
Cars snake out of the medical centre car park and right down the road.
It's probably just a cold, but we just thought, should get checked out. There's a bit of uncertainty now about what's out there.
So I started feeling sick, and I told my boss and he told me to come get a test.
I just feel like I've got a normal cold.
But we must ask, how accurate and trustworthy were these tests? Could we trust that the government had this right? As far as we can see, the government had major problems with finding and acting on trustworthy data about masks and infection fatality rates. Was there a chance that there could be issues with the PCR test? The government was having major problems with testing in COVID quarantine sites, so they called in the military. Restricted military documents leaked to me in 2020 showed that despite the government saying it was a new initiative to use the military, it was actually their intention right from the beginning. We will cover this more later in the documentary.
Earlier in the week, the Prime Minister told us she was bringing in the military to deal with this. It was already in the mix, with 36 Defence Force personnel on the job. Today, that number doubled. Digby Webb was already involved too, but says he didn't have anything to do with this botch-up.
None whatsoever.
He's now in charge of managing quarantine for those returning home.
Inevitably, COVID testing soon became a requirement for Kiwis returning home from overseas. This was unprecedented and caused much anxiety.
I've got mine booked at 7:30 a.m. the following morning, so I'm down to 61. And then, of course, I have to check in. Now, Emirates are not going to let me on that plane unless I've got a certificate. That's 3 hours before the flight. So I'm now down to 58.
The whole ordeal is costly. People are potentially paying $3,000 for a flight home, a similar amount for a stint in managed isolation. Add on the cost of a COVID test, another $300.
An example of yet another measure imposed on New Zealanders. Pretty soon, as with face masks, testing also became a virtuous symbol that you cared for your family and community. So you'd better get tested to know if you had the disease. Does that sound weird to you? So we need to ask the question, how reliable is the PCR test really? Let's ask the inventor of the PCR test, Professor Kerry Mullis, what he thinks of it.
I don't think you can misuse PCR. No, the results, the interpretation of it. See, if you can say, if they could find this virus in you at all, and with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. But it allows you to take a very minuscule amount of anything and make it measurable and then talk about it in meetings and stuff like it is important.
So wait a minute. Did Professor Kerry Mullis just tell us that the PCR test is non-specific and that it actually doesn't tell you if you are sick? And then if you use it the right way, you can find anything in anybody? That doesn't sound very reliable to me, does it? So why should we trust the reliability of the PCR test? Let's find some objective opinions about this matter, because this is very important.
Kerry Mullis, who was the physician researcher who actually developed the PCR test, and Kerry Mullis himself was a very outspoken critic of Fauci, and he also said that the PCR test cannot be used to diagnose an active infection. The PCR test is designed to pick up a signature. That's all it's supposed to do, okay? It's just picking up a signature. So all you can say is that, yeah, the presence of X is here or not. That's all it is.
After taking a COVID test, you get the results.
you've tested positive. You are infected with a large amount of the virus and contagious. Your recent contacts need to quarantine, and you might need to be admitted to hospital. Right? Wrong. I'll start with a story of 3 men who wanted to fly from Singapore to Bangkok. These men had already been sick with COVID and recovered. Their return to Thailand was contingent on testing negative for the virus in Singapore. So in Singapore, they were tested and their negative results were certified by the Thai embassy. However, when they landed in Bangkok and entered quarantine and were tested again, the results were positive. This brought all kinds of speculation in the media that these men had been reinfected. Come along with me as we break down this case and understand how it underscores the need for us to change how we talk about COVID testing. I'll show you how COVID testing really works and what needs to change. Testing has become an integral part of a 3-pronged strategy to reduce transmission of the virus: case identification, contact tracing, and quarantine and isolation of exposed and infected individuals. Yet, despite the broad application of this strategy, the global number of cases continues to accelerate. So are we doing something wrong? To understand what we're doing wrong, we have to first understand how COVID testing works. Molecular tests have been the most common diagnostic tool to detect cases of COVID-19. Specifically, we're going to talk about testing using reverse transcriptase quantitative polymerase chain reaction, or just PCR testing for short. The first step is to take a swab of your nasal or throat area. That sample is sent to a laboratory where they will use the PCR technique. And they use PCR to look for specific sequences of genetic matter that are characteristic of the COVID virus. Since the bits of viral genetic matter might be tiny, PCR amplifies that genetic matter in a series of cycles. It amplifies those genetic bits over and over until there's enough to be detected. If a sample has lots of virus in it, it should only take a few cycles to amplify the viral bits enough to be detected. But if a sample only has trace amounts of the virus, it will take many more cycles to amplify that small bit of virus such that it can be detected. The number of cycles it takes until a detectable amount of virus has been replicated is called a cycle threshold, or CT. And that brings us to how we're interpreting test results wrong. Think of those 2 samples, one full of virus, the other with only trace amounts. In either case, the results will be returned as positive. But if you remember, the power in testing is not just knowing you're sick, but in identifying people who are infectious before they can infect others. Generally, the approach has been that if someone tests positive, then we interpret that they are actively infected and are infectious. The problem is both of these interpretations are not necessarily correct. First, testing positive doesn't mean you're still infectious. To be infectious, which means being able to make someone else sick, requires 2 things. First, it requires that you are shedding virus. Shedding virus means that virus is found in your droplets created when you sneeze, cough, or breathe. PCR testing absolutely tells us whether you are shedding virus. The second thing infectiousness requires, though, is that the virus you're shedding is viable. In other words, that the virus can survive and grow. PCR doesn't do this.
So again, as with the masks and infection fatality rate issues, the PCR issue and narrative was also coming unstuck. And then information began to appear which raised serious concerns about the use of the PCR test. It turned out that the PCR test could not distinguish between viruses and could not tell if someone currently had COVID or had previously had it. There was no way to tell because it would still pick up old fragments of a virus that could be identified as COVID-19. This meant that the numbers could be wrong, dramatically wrong. Then mysteriously and suddenly, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention in the USA and the FDA announced that the PCR test had failed its performance review and would be withdrawn from service. This is a bit strange, isn't it? What was the problem? Stories emerged from countries such as Portugal, ruling that the PCR test was unreliable and therefore could not be used to quarantine people or label them as COVID positive. And the PCR wheels kept rolling and rolling until they started to fall off. To top it all off, the president of Tanzania conducted a covert operation by using the test kits supplied to him by the UN and the WHO to test a goat and a papaya. Both came back positive for COVID-19, and the president attacked all aspects of the COVID-19 narrative.
6 months later, he was dead. A coincidence, of course. But now articles, including some in medical sector journals, were published criticising the use of PCRs to detect COVID and infectious people. It couldn't do either, bringing the entire pandemic into question. Yet, the WHO and the New Zealand government still urged the use of the PCR tests, although the way the PCR test was used in New Zealand heightened the chances of false positives. How? Because New Zealand was using over 35 to 40 cycles in the testing process. Yet, the suggested rate is 30 and under. The more cycles you use, the more sensitive it is and less reliable the test becomes.
There's no guarantee you're even identifying live virus. It seems to me that if you're test positive with no symptoms with a very sensitive PCR test, and they can't even tell you if you're infectious, we're quarantining across the country probably hundreds of thousands or millions of people who aren't even contagious. And I think that obviously has a huge cost to society. Doesn't seem to be getting a lot of discussion, though.
If you have a very tiny amount of the virus, or if it's a viral fragment that's not actually that your body has successfully attacked, then what you're amplifying is something that's not going to pose any risk either to you or to others. We effectively are quarantining people on the basis of PCR tests, a functional false positive PCR tests, where it will have no effect on disease spread because they're not infectious.
As with the way they mishandled the face mask and infection fatality rate issues, was there a chance that the New Zealand government had also mismanaged something as fundamental as testing? And were they using a tool to test you that could misdiagnose you as being infectious when it cannot even do that in the first place? The whole justification for the government's COVID-19 response was starting to look very dubious. And the narrative that they pushed so hard seemed to have very questionable scientific basis or none at all. But we need to ask these questions. Where was this all leading? And why were they doing things this way? Next on the government's agenda was telling people that they needed to apply a social distance approach to prevent transmission of the virus. You had to be 6 feet physically apart from another human and wear a mask. But the strange thing was this. The rules for hospitality venues meant that you had to wear a mask when you entered a venue, but you didn't need to wear one when you sat down to eat. So the implication was this, that this bug was intelligent, so intelligent it knew when and where you were standing. This wasn't a super bug, it was a super intelligent bug.
So seriously, the New Zealand government took on social distancing the same way it took on IFR projections and face masks. Their actions had no scientific backing, and they were unflagging in this task, publishing warning material everywhere about social distancing and mask wearing. But what is social distancing? As with face mask wearing, they made social distancing a sign of virtue, and of course, always without the science. But also, as usual, the New Zealand government used authoritarian tactics to get their way, and they decided to enforce social distancing. Then they announced the end of social distancing. The world celebrated that New Zealand had conquered COVID.
We moved down to COVID-19 alert level 1 from midnight tonight.
What's your immediate reaction when you heard there were no active cases of COVID-19 remaining in New Zealand?
I did a little dance.
The New Zealand government danced and celebrated, but soon data emerged all around the world that the social distancing strategy was bogus. Article after article told us of massive problems with governments telling people to practice social distancing, including mental health issues from lack of contact, especially for children and the elderly. The CDC and US government were leading the way for the world and providing advice to governments. Anthony Fauci was the US lead, followed closely by Dr. Deborah Birx, and both of them told the world we needed to wear masks and do social distancing.
Do you think it will be weeks, not months, that this social distancing will be required?
I think the question is really, can we be laser focused rather than generic across the country? In other words, can we use our data in a laser focused, granular way to really look at what's happening on the ground and adjust our public health messages based on what is actually needed by the number of cases and the work that we're doing with the communities?
But Dr. Birx wrote a book which contained some disturbing revelations.
But you were digging into, and this is so important, Dr. Birx's new biography, which to me reads like a confession.
And she said that the U.S. did not have sufficient data to back up the plans that she wanted for lockdowns and for economic shutdowns. She said actually that the goal was to introduce greater and greater shutdown measures, but to do it slowly, one piece at a time. She brought each new plan for the shutdown, such as the 15 days to stop the spread and all of this, one little piece at a time, not revealing that her true intentions were to go much further.
Dr. Birx, like Fauci, had been heralded as a trustworthy voice, but it is now clear that like Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College and Sean Hendy of Auckland University, she had propagated a narrative that was not supported by science. The question is why?
Another good question to ask is this. If New Zealand had a ton of medical experts advising the government, why had they not tested what the international advisors were saying for themselves? The consequences of getting their decisions wrong would be disastrous.
Then Dr. Birx was discovered breaching her own advice to the government. While forcing millions of Americans to stay home and not travel to see family during the Thanksgiving holidays, she was caught out traveling with her own family. In fact, with 3 generations of her own family.
Right before Thanksgiving, health officials were warning everyone to stay home for the holidays and limit family gatherings to avoid spreading the virus.
You need to take it upon yourself to be restrictive. You need to not go to these places. You need to protect your family now. And really watch, if your family traveled, you have to assume that you were exposed and you became infected, and you really need to get tested in the next week.
Now we're learning Dr. Deborah Birx traveled out of state over Thanksgiving weekend with 3 generations of her family from 2 separate households, disregarding her own advice.
New Zealand was not immune to the hypocrisy virus either. During the first lockdown, the health minister, of all people, gave a demonstration of supreme arrogance by showing how he believed the rules he was helping to enforce did not apply to him. And then one of New Zealand's own government advisors, someone who promoted social distancing, staying in your bubble and staying home, was also found to be breaking her own advice. It became clear that hypocrisy was everywhere, and this time, Dr. Susie Wiles, like Dr. Birx, got caught out. Badly. All while wanting to keep Kiwis locked down. Let's look at what she was telling people when the government was starting to ease restrictions. She wanted everyone to remain locked down. While she worked from home on a salary and went to the beach, people were losing lives and livelihoods.
What's your reaction to yesterday's announcement?
Oh, look, I'm kind of gutted, I guess. Partly because this was a step that I hoped that we'd be taking sometime next year when we had vaccines available for all of our children.
Let's see what one member of Parliament had to say about her actions. I think she sums it up quite nicely.
She's a big fat hypocrite, actually. And I'm sick and tired of listening to her telling everyone else what to do. And here we have the evidence that she had travelled from Freeman's Bay to go and visit with her friend on the beach in Judges Bay in Parnell. Well, that's about 5 kilometres. And unless she ran there, and I doubt it, then she wasn't exercising. No mask on, sitting there on the beach, and his friend goes off for a swim. I watched that video too, Christian, and I thought, big fat hypocrite.
Back to Dr. Birx. Next, she announced her own retirement in disgrace.
This comes after White House coronavirus response coordinator Dr. Deborah Birx came under fire for taking a family trip over Thanksgiving while advising all Americans to stay home for the holiday. Dr. Birx just announced her retirement.
Resignations would soon become commonplace for doctors, medical bureaucrats and politicians and mainstream media. The sad thing is, because of unsound advice like this, things were about to get worse, a lot worse. Unsupported by science, the New Zealand government was about to launch its most devastating and destructive plan yet. It was the elimination strategy and the decision to use lockdowns to deal with COVID-19. New Zealand was about to be reborn yet again. So we've learned that the government's IFR modellings were wrong, very wrong. We've also learned that they knew about this in early 2021. We've also learned that face masks don't protect you, and that the way they used the PCR test was unreliable, and that social distancing was arbitrary and made up. It leads us to ask that question again. How could they have got it all so very, very wrong? From the social distancing concept emerged the elimination and lockdown strategy, where they said they would flatten the curve, break the chain of transmission, and eliminate COVID-19 in New Zealand. The New Zealand Labour government decided to apply this strategy, one that no other country would attempt. They planned to do for COVID what had proved impossible to do for common diseases such as cold, flu, or chickenpox. This would lead to the implementation of the most draconian law New Zealand has ever known, the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act 2020. As part of the elimination strategy, they introduced the oppressive and destructive lockdowns. Let's look at how this elimination and lockdown game plan worked out. First step, carry on with the COVID Death Fair campaign. Second step, encourage big businesses such as supermarkets to buy into the program by preventing their competitors from trading. Then promote that it is all working. The New Zealand government telegraphed the success of the elimination strategy all around the world. Our Prime Minister said,
"I did a little dance,"
to celebrate the success, and Sean Hendy made the claim we had beaten it. And the experts, those unaccountable, untouchable, and sometimes unidentified individuals, said that elimination was the best strategy.
Right now, the experts are telling us to take on Delta differently, but they've also told us to stick with the elimination strategy for now. In their view, it's not only possible, it remains the best strategy, and I totally agree.
But soon as with their other actions, cracks started to appear in this strategy as well. Hendy was now operating with a gut feeling that elimination was still a possibility. A gut feeling?
What modelling scenarios show elimination, and when might we achieve that?
Yeah, so if we keep this reproductive number at about 0.5, then in a couple of weeks we think it's actually more likely than not we'll have eliminated. That's the model, and there's a lot of expertise. There's a lot of public health expertise. People who have worked at the front lines who have a gut feeling, and they're also thinking that if we stay at level 4 long enough, then we've got a chance of elimination.
And while Hendy, like other academics, was working from home and receiving a large pay packet from his government funding contract, he advised that the government needed to remain on level 4 lockdown. Could we be justified in thinking that he was using lockdowns as a way to justify himself and failed modellings? And the lockdowns destroyed people's lives, livelihoods, and the economy, creating a dystopian, fearful, and segregated society. So politicians and medical bureaucrats were closing New Zealand down with their lockdowns and threatened all those who said no to their unscientific demands. There were, however, people who saw the consequences of these harsh and arbitrary lockdowns and rightfully decided to disobey them. Others who saw the effects of the lockdowns up close and had to deal with the fallout tried to apply a band-aid to a devastated society. So let's hear what some of these people have to say, starting with the story of Steve Oliver from Oliver's MMA gym in Auckland. And let's see what type of kindness the New Zealand government showed him. How important to you and to the community was that this facility was open during the lockdowns?
Yeah, it's huge. Just people don't respond well to being isolated. It's just not healthy. It's not healthy physically, mentally, the whole thing. And the government, that was the government's business model, was to tell everyone to lock yourself in your closet and don't talk to anybody. It's just unbelievable. Since they're supposed to be the health experts, But we've got our ear to the ground. We're in the community. These people seem to be very disconnected from what's actually happening on the street to the advice they're handing out as far as forecasts and all that just seem to be right out of the whack. It just doesn't seem to be anything close to being reality. We just knew there was kids coming in here that were very hard hit with the impacts of being kicked out of their networks, and some of these kids you couldn't get an exemption even if it's going to kill you. That's the reality from the vaccine. So we had kids in here that couldn't have the vaccine. It wasn't just an issue about they didn't want it, they couldn't have it. And they were kicked out of their networks, from sport to, their friends to everything. These kids at 12, 13 years old, which is just unbelievable that you'd expose a kid at that age where they're finding who they are and their identity in life, and that you'd expose them to that sort of trauma is just unbelievable from the government. But that's what we were dealing with. We were dealing with these kids that were suicidal, very bad depression, and their parents were coming in here and saying, if you close, I don't know if my kid's going to make it.
Steve Oliver continued to put the needs of the community ahead of his own interests and kept providing fitness and health programs for local people, both young and old. Sure enough, Olivers were prosecuted and fined. The kindness he displayed to his community was not replicated by the state. Around the world, with very few exceptions, governments of all stripes imposed strict lockdown measures on their citizens. Was this the right policy to beat the virus? There were, however, some scientists and doctors who spoke out against these harsh measures. Just like Dr. Simon Thornley, Dr. John Ioannidis of Stanford University, Professor of Medicine, Epidemiology and Population Health, had his views on this issue.
Shutdowns are an extreme measure. We know very well that they have tremendous harms. They have tremendous harms on people, on their lives, on their health, on their mental health, on their ability to get the best care for major problems like heart attacks, like cancer care. They can take a major toll on unemployment. They can take a major toll on leaving people who are disadvantaged even more disadvantaged.
Professor John Ioannidis analysed the effectiveness of lockdowns and the modelling that had been used to justify them.
Lockdown had no benefit. Well, which model is best? They're both by the best team in the world. And guess what? The model that has the best fit is the one that shows that lockdown has no benefit. Compared to Sweden and South Korea, that didn't have the draconian components, the other countries did not do any better. Actually, they tended to do worse. Countries that had the most draconian restrictive measures compared to those who had some measures that were restrictive, but not the draconian version, the draconian ones did worse. And there's many reasons that can explain that. With draconian measures, basically, you limit the space and time that people have available to move around. Why do we get more deaths from this type of infections in the winter? Because we have to shut ourselves down. So what do? We shut ourselves down even more. That's exactly the wrong recipe to respond. We run the risk of having excess deaths from the same measures that we're using to try to avoid deaths. Most scientists believe that this coronavirus will become endemic, and this is a slide that is a few months old. I think it has become endemic.
But after their early success, COVID was suddenly back again. I had worked out in early May 2021 from government announcements that the COVID injection would arrive in New Zealand for mass rollout in late July or early August. I accurately predicted that they would lock us down in mid-August to bring pressure on the population to accept vaccination. And right on time, they did exactly that. The lockdown harm was going to start again.
In just hours from now, New Zealand will go into lockdown. It's after the country detected its first locally transmitted case of coronavirus for 6 months.
The mental health of New Zealanders since COVID-19 lockdowns began in 2020 has simply plummeted. I know from reports in mainstream media and from the government themselves that over 5,600 young kids over the age of 10 have had self-harm incidents and been admitted into hospital emergency rooms across New Zealand. I want to interview a dear friend of mine who is the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. He's the guy that picks up the phone and deals with someone down the other end of the phone line who wants to hurt themselves or someone else because of pain and suffering and fear and anger that they go through. But what I want to explore today is what he has seen since the government started to roll out its COVID-19 measures. Mike, this is a difficult topic that we're talking about today. We're talking about the mental health impact of the government's COVID-19 response strategies. Before we get into that, what's your background with mental health?
My background is, community support, helplines, prison environments, etc. And I've sort of worked in the mental health sector as well as the addiction sector. Across the board really with the community, because we can go deep into that stuff around on childhood, domestic violence, sexual abuse, and just how people cope from childhood into adulthood as well.
I want to talk to you about what you've seen since the New Zealand government implemented their COVID-19 health response strategy.
A shock to the system. That's really how I'd describe it. You've got healthy people being locked down, which was a first in human history. Very strange. You've got, I guess, people who are used to doing things like travel, doing their things that keep them happy, suddenly having that subtracted. Also support systems and networks that were available. I'm thinking of things like addiction supports. We saw people fall down, maybe pick up if it was a drug of some sort that was a harm to them. People who weren't used to the kind of conditions that they were placed under, not having the coping skills and the resilience. And so that was probably the key thing that happened, was children, youth, adults, all of them across the board struggled, and the thing is, when you don't have those coping skills, things go wrong. There was a significant rise in homicides. Domestic violence, sure, it went up, and I think a big part of that was, we've talked about the coping skills, the isolation and close proximity, when you had restrictions on movement, people in houses, family, stuck in a coop basically. The problem with the lack of coping skills is that people had outbursts, and unfortunately went to the next level with that.
Right, so you've had a bit to do with providing support to prisoners. You and I talked off air about some of the things that you came across with male prisoners that had committed certain crimes. What were a couple of those crimes that you saw were a direct outcome of this proximity problem during the lockdowns? What happened?
There were men who did actually commit homicide on their children. So that is a fact that happened. It's a sad fact, but it did happen. It's just caused so much damage to people, to people's livelihoods, businesses. You mentioned people's mental health. There's a lot of people now who can't work due to their mental health. Depression's been on the increase.
Has New Zealand been kind?
Has kindness meant that people have kept their livelihood, that have lost their businesses, that have fallen down?
Said goodbye to loved ones that are dying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's had its limitations around funerals, etc.
Kind, yes or no?
100% no.
Given your time with young people and as a psychologist, what is the impact that lockdowns have had on Kiwi kids?
Many different impacts would have occurred, all pretty much at the same time. The government narrative that COVID was to be feared and children should get vaccinated as a moral duty, as a way of preventing them from getting infected and potentially killing grandparents or elderly and their families. Those sorts of things which were in the media very often would have made children excessively afraid for chronic periods of time, and being in that state has all sorts of detrimental effects on brain development, for example, on memory, on attention, concentration, and when you're stuck in that chronic fight-flight response. You get angry easily, you get anxious easily, you can even be anxious for no reason because it's just become habituated in your nervous system. Basically, children and adults were taught to fear an invisible enemy that they couldn't see, that they couldn't defend against. Going outside was a dangerous thing, and you didn't know if you're going to come back and survive going outside and mixing with other people or not. There's a whole lot of other effects in terms of having no social contact with their peer group, not being in a structured learning environment, the effects on education, on intelligence development of all of that, basically deprivation, emotional deprivation, intellectual stimulation deprivation. So the effects are very, very widespread and I would say long-lasting.
The New Zealand Herald and other mainstream media have reported that across the 2022 period and the preceding year, there was about just on almost 6,000 young people hospitalised in emergency rooms across New Zealand due to self-harm incidents related to lockdown anxiety. Is that to be expected?
Yes, very much so, and I understand that was, from looking at that article, it was a 9% increase on the previous year, so that is a big jump. In terms of those sorts of behaviours are very high-end serious behaviours, acts of desperation and lack of hope. Children and adults, one of our primary needs is to feel safe and secure, not just physically but emotionally, and probably that is our most fundamental emotional need as human beings. And then to go through ongoing lockdowns, massive uncertainties, to be ripped away from normal routines and environments like friendship groups and school activities and sports, all of that basically told kids for 2 years roughly that the world is really unpredictable, it's really unsafe, and the only place where you might be safe is in home, in your home. And
locked away.
Yeah, locked away basically, and away, and even in the home, you can infect others can come in and infect you. So there's actually, the government message was that for that whole period, children are not safe.
Across the funeral director sector, how has suicide represented itself over the last couple of years since lockdowns began?
I know with the mandates, there were a lot of people who lost their jobs. It was a no jab, no job situation. So a lot of employees and a lot of businesses closed. Personally, I have 2 friends who own restaurants, very, very top restaurants in New Zealand, lost everything, lost their whole life, and as a consequence, lost their life as well. Literally, they took their own life. So 2 of my friends took their life through suicide. So it's dear to my heart. There have been an increase in the number of suicides because people just haven't been able to cope financially, losing their job, losing their career, losing their house, and we've seen an increase in suicides.
New Zealanders from every walk of life have been protesting and speaking up against the loss of human rights, the loss of our democracy, lockdown harm. People have been speaking up, yet the government says that these people, and I'm going to say it again, nut job conspiracy theorists, tinfoil hat wearers, lone keyboard warriors that are just simply unstable. But the problem with that narrative is that you've got doctors, lawyers, nurses, educationalists, mechanics, engineers, policemen, military, people from every walk of life who aren't unstable, who are just ordinary people who know how to think and think critically, are coming to the same conclusion, that there are massive problems in New Zealand emanating from the COVID-19 issue. Now, what's really important to understand is that the backbone of our beautiful country here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the salt of the earth community of farmers. And yet farmers have been hugely impacted over the last 2 or more years by the decisions made by this government. And I'm here today to talk to a very special man who is a member of this community, and he's worked it out himself and applied critical thinking, and he's come up with the only thing
You really can. Let's go and see what this man has to say.
G'day, I'm Andrew Jackson, Waka Valley, South Otago. I'm running 250 hectares, I think it is, intensive sheep and cattle here, pretty much by myself with a bit of casual help or summer help. Don't really have time to muck around with off-farm stuff too much, but in this case I've had to be involved because bigger picture it's more important than the farm. So you could say I've just had to cope with a bit less sleep, especially last summer when there was more protesting done. Yep. So I've never been involved in protesting before, but the situation that we were put in with the erosion of our freedoms here in New Zealand made me step out of my comfort zone, and I was very uneasy about doing it. In fact, a friend basically forced me to talk, and then that introduced me to the concept. Because it's more important than the farming business, I had to do it. Plus morally, I felt it was important to protect the rights and the freedoms of New Zealanders. I think it's just really important for people to realise that the one source of truth, the media, is not telling you the truth. Do you realise how this is actually affecting our community, dividing us? And are you okay with 5 to 11-year-olds getting jabbed? Because I'm not. It's our future. It's your grandkids or your kids or whatever. It's not okay.
How do you feel as a farmer when you look at the lockdowns?
Okay, so for me personally, I'm confident, high-producing, good with the calculator. I know how to solve problems. For the second time in my farming career, I sought the help of a farm consultant because I got backed into a corner. I couldn't kill stock. I didn't have the feed. I could sell them at store prices, which was a small portion of what I knew they were worth, and I just simply didn't know what to do. That doesn't happen to me. I don't have those problems. Fortunately, a consultant was able to help supply me with information that I weren't used to having to pull and got me out of that area, because that was about as stressed as I probably haven't been that stressed that I can remember in recent times. But what if I weren't a person who made the phone call and said I need help? What would that do to someone like myself who didn't reach out for help? How many people do we have to kill with suicides before you go, oh, that's not a good idea?
I've lost mates. I've buried so many mates due to suicide over the last year. It's killing the industry. And for the first time in my life, I'm actually considering getting out of farming. And most of the people you're going to meet here today are the same. We're all going, do we have a future? There's no profitability in it. How are we going to do this? I'm fifth generation. I think my kids, which are sixth generation, will be lucky to be involved in agriculture. Unless something changes dramatically.
What are your thoughts about the way that the governments have used lockdowns as their response to COVID-19?
Well, I think it wasn't done by accident. It was done by design.
Yeah.
If the agenda, first you have to ask yourself, what is the agenda? And I've been very, very open as far as what I think the agenda is. I said it during my interview with CNN. I've said it pretty much in all the big major news interviews that I've been interviewed by, that the agenda is population control. It's a depopulation agenda, or it's a reproductive control agenda. Whatever it is, it goes back to the white paper that Bill Gates put out 20 plus years ago, that the world's population could not be sustained at the growth rate that it was at, and that the world's population should be decreased down to 500 million people. And our population right now is at 8 billion people, which means that if we were to hit the milestones that Bill Gates was talking about, then we would have to have 15 out of every 16 people in the world would have to be eliminated.
This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to 0. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to 0. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to 0. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
It's not surprising that the route that was chosen would be to create fear-mongering, to create division among people, to separate them, isolate them. Humans are herd animals. And the best way to create mayhem and chaos in herd animals is to separate them out. You start isolating animals that are herd animals, you start seeing them become very destructive and very panicked. And of course, that's what's going to happen with humans. You isolate them, people are going to get depressed, they're going to become suicidal. The actual number of people worldwide that committed suicide, the number of people worldwide that, with the level of child abuse, the level of domestic abuse, the level of spousal abuse that occurred, and the level of suicide and violence in homes. I mean, those numbers, nobody's talking about those numbers, but those are huge numbers. I mean, it's caused massive amounts of scarring.
It's global. It's violence around the world has escalated 30+%. There's a UN conducted a study, and they found that homicides are going up. Some of it can be explained because of when we're locked down, we don't like restrictions. Some of it can be explained certainly with property crime going up because of economic depravity.
People separated, loneliness, suicide, drug use, alcohol use, domestic violence, all of those things. Do you think lockdowns were the right way to go?
I was in favour of border controls. But for lockdowns, really, you just got to go across and look at somewhere like Sweden, where they didn't have lockdowns. And you find that their outcomes were as low as or lower than other Nordic countries that did have lockdowns. And I don't think lockdowns contributed much, except, as you say, they contributed to a lot of social harm and a lot of economic harm. It's not supported by the science, as it's turned out.
Immediately I said, this is proof of a supranational agreement. And they went, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. I said, okay, you give me any explanation, a benign explanation of why all these people are doing these things. They say, oh, it's they're reacting to a threat. I said, no, we all have well-honed pandemic preparedness plans. It's important people know that. It's not that this is a surprise. And so each country that's got, an advanced culture would have like a 40-page emergency response plan. It could be an earthquake or an invasion or pandemic infectious disease. We had some. I've read about 6 of them. None of them mention anything other than when you're sick, stay home, wash your hands more often than usual until we understand transmission. That, folks, is it. That's what every country's pandemic preparedness plan in 2019 said. That was the WHO plan for influenza. I'll tell you what they specifically excluded: locking down the healthy, mass testing of those who with no symptoms, closing businesses, closing schools, border restrictions, distancing, masking, all of those things. So you all recognise all the things you've had to do are explicitly excluded. They're not just not in the plan, they're mentioned and explicitly excluded on the grounds that, 2 grounds. One, the evidence that they would do anything useful is skinny, between slim and non, and they're obviously enormously impactful in a negative way on people's business life, psychological health, spiritual health, and so on.
The governments of the world, including New Zealand, had inexplicably abandoned the accepted practices of how to deal with the pandemic and acted illogically and without any sense of restraint to their authoritarian behaviour. Again, why? To conquer an influenza equivalent respiratory disease without science-backed measures and adequate due diligence? Important institutions like MIT, Stanford University, and even Johns Hopkins University have warned against the use of lockdowns and challenged the COVID-19 narrative. Let's look at what the Johns Hopkins report actually has to say. And this writer got it completely right. No one who advocated lockdowns should be anywhere near public health policy again, and should actually be facing criminal charges. Our own Dr. Simon Thornley had specifically told the government they had got it wrong. He had warned them. Yet he was arrogantly diminished and attacked by mainstream media and academia. All the while, Sean Hendy received accolades for his failed modelings. All the while, his firm had been paid $6 million for his work. Yes, you heard that correctly. The New Zealand government under Arden was now showing its true self, a totalitarian regime bent on making people obey their COVID edicts, policies that were not backed by science. But why? But despite their assurances that they knew what they were doing, the cracks turned into a massive gaping hole and the whole narrative and strategy collapsed. The government backpedaled fast, but the damage was done. Suicides, lives, dreams, and our economy was destroyed, and civil liberties were under permanent threat from the power of the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. And ministers were now sorry for using lockdowns as they had. Were they trapped by their own mechanism of mistruth by using the faulty PCR test that gave them the cases but proved that an elimination and then vaccination didn't work? Why did they persist in using lockdowns? I think Anthony Fauci explains it clearly for us.
You use lockdowns to get people vaccinated.
I wanted to take some time to talk about this next segment myself. I didn't want to script anything. I just wanted to speak from my heart to you, to the camera. This is perhaps something very personal to me, as it involves myself getting arrested and my dear friend Vinnie Eastwood getting arrested with me for protesting against lockdown harm. On August the 17th, 2021, as we've probably already spoken about in the documentary, the New Zealand government decided that it would lock New Zealand down for one case of COVID-19. It was a terrifying prospect, and I had learned the year before, in 2020, I knew that it was going to harm countless numbers of New Zealanders. I knew that it would destroy businesses, livelihoods, all those things. But I knew that people would be scared, fearful, angry, distressed, and I knew that tragically, a lot of people would probably end up taking their lives, which is exactly what happened. And so when they announced this lockdown, I knew that I had to speak up about it and protest against the harm that the New Zealand government was causing our people here in New Zealand. And so I made the fateful decision to go and organise a protest on the steps of our state television company in Auckland, in our largest city. And we had an outdoor protest, less than 100 people, peaceful, friendly, well organised, security people making sure people were safe, traffic management, all those good things. And like every other protest I'd ever been involved with, I'd made sure that I coordinated with the police, the New Zealand police. That was important to me to keep people, protesters, and police safe. So, unlike other protests I had done, the police had not turned up to meet me that morning to discuss how we were going to approach the day's event. Anyway, 5 minutes before the end of this protest event, it only went for less than an hour, I was arrested for breaching the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. And unbelievably, immediately after my arrest, so was my dear friend Vinnie Eastwood, a hero alternative media and truth media broadcaster, in fact the very first that we had in New Zealand. We were both arrested, and instead of being taken to a police station and processed and let go of, we were actually taken to the Mount Eden Prison Remand Centre and we were locked up for a day and a half, and the police did not want to let us go. Fortunately, we got bail, we were let out, but under very, very harsh and restrictive bail conditions. But on the 15th and 16th of December 2022, we were found guilty of breaching the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. And on the 31st of March 2023, I was sentenced to 5 months prison, reduced down to 4 months, because I'd spent 19 days under house arrest. Vinny was sentenced to 4 months and had his sentence reduced down to 3 months because he had 5 weeks under house arrest. These charges are the most harshest charges that anyone in New Zealand has received for breaching COVID-19 rules. And in fact, another person who did exactly what I did, organised the protest and attended it, received a $100 fine. So we've appealed the sentence. It's been hugely stressful and just a terrible thing to live through. It's been politically motivated. They've not liked me, and they've also harmed my dear friend Vinny in the process. You're about to see the footage of my arrest and Vinny's arrest now, and you're going to listen to the interview with Vinny, and I pray that you will get a sense of what has happened to him and to me through what we're about to share. If this is a kind version of New Zealand, if this is the kind vision that Jacinda Ardern had for New Zealand, I'd hate to see her version of a cruel New Zealand.
I'm under arrest right now. I'm happy to comply. No, it's all right. Hey, it's all right. Do not force me. Do not force me. Hey, no violence. No violence. I'm getting arrested, but these guys are good guys. They don't want to see violence. We don't want to see violence.
Kindness.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go for it. Yes. All right, so, you know what? We knew this was coming.
Stop everybody, please! Stay calm! And peace in your spirit! Please! Please be calm, guys! We are calm! Please calm down!
Kindness.
Please surround me! Please protect me! Do not be angry, do not be upset, but do not consent. Please stay by my side. Please protect me from arrest. I have a 1-year-old daughter and a wife at home that I want to return home to.
Kindness and empathy.
I do not understand, and I will not stand down. They're about to take me. They're going to try and take me. Look, there's a huge ladder. Now, please, cluster around me. Please protect me. Please protect me from them. Do not let them take me. No, don't let them take me. Okay, I'm coming. I will consent. I will follow your orders. I will follow your orders. I will follow your orders. I will not resist. Please,
we're going to hold the plea. No. Hold on.
Vinny, the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990 guarantees freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of expression of political, religious thought, and really importantly, the right to peaceful assembly.
Let's not forget as well the right to distribute any information in any form.
On August the 18th, 2021, the government decided that it was going to lock New Zealand down because of 1 or 2, maybe 3 cases of the COVID-19. And you and I both knew back then that it was going to cause massive harm. We'd already seen the evidence of it through the previous lockdowns. We had a small protest on the 18th of August. Nobody was hurt, no cases were identified from that protest, no property was damaged, but you and I were arrested and we were incarcerated for 28 hours. The police did not want to let us go either. They opposed our bail. What do you think happened there?
We would still be in jail awaiting trial as we speak over a year later now if the police had their way. If you think that the news isn't a fantasy, then you would have been absolutely sure that every single person who didn't obey the lockdown, every single person was a super spreading, like that kind of thing. It was just absolute paranoia and I would say hyperbolizing the threat that was faced, and it created a mass psychosis, I believe, a mass mental illness that affected the police and the judiciary and the media and the government and thus the general population. And we're still living with the fallout of that psychosis, and people who are suffering a form of psychosis will do horrible things, much like the witch burnings back in the day.
We've seen ourselves arrested. Instead of going right towards where I knew that the police station was, they took a left, and I knew immediately then that they were taking us to the Mount Eden prison remand facility, and I knew that they weren't going to let us go. What did you think?
It's very strange that we're not going to the Central Police Station, and I had no idea that we were going to like a remand prison kind of thing. And the bail conditions that we suffered under: no internet, no access to mobile devices, no leaving your home 24 hours a day, bail checks at like 11 o'clock at night, 4 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, that kind of thing. While I had a wife and 1-year-old daughter trying to sleep. It was probably, I've been studying activism and things that the police have done to activists of this country, and I'd never seen anything like it, not even close. This was something so brutal and so that smacked of fear.
You use lockdowns to get people vaccinated.
Jacinda Ardern and all of her experts and the combined wisdom and exclusive access to the science and truth had to finally admit that their strategies were never going to deal with COVID-19, and so they were finally abandoned. And Ardern tried to talk her way out of it.
The return to zero is incredibly difficult, and our restrictions alone are not enough to achieve it quickly. In fact, for this outbreak, it's clear that long periods of heavy restrictions has not got us to zero cases. But that is okay.
No, it wasn't okay. Ardern, along with her advisors, Sean Hendy, Michael Baker, and Susie Wiles, had caused massive harm to New Zealanders from their advice and the measures that they introduced, and now they try to pretend it all meant nothing. Surprise, surprise! Government-funded mainstream media remains silent about this incredible failure and let them all off the hook, yet continue to provide a platform of mis- and disinformation for the government's COVID-19 propaganda. New Zealand media organisations were now full partners in what could be described as some of the greatest crimes committed against the people of New Zealand. We have been on a journey together, and we have looked carefully at the claims of the New Zealand government about COVID, and we've found serious flaws with their narrative. The questions remain. Why have they done this? And where is it heading? In episode 2, we will continue our journey and hear the stories of those Kiwis affected by lockdowns and dealing with the most serious issue of COVID-19, vaccines. We're going to look at how the vaccine arrived in New Zealand, its safety and performance, and examine how the New Zealand government managed to convince New Zealanders to take on a new form of drug without hesitation. We will hear the stories of those brave people willing to share their experience dealing with vaccine mandates and even worse, vaccine harm. We will also begin our examination of the New Zealand mainstream media, a sector that has been very antagonistic towards people who have voiced their concern about the government's COVID response. We will look at these organisations and their reporters who've been so hostile to freedom of speech and truth and ask that question again. Why? Stand by for episode 2 of the River of Lies New Zealand Scandemic. The truth is coming.
showed me the slide, y'all, and the both of it made me whole. Flag ain't right. Oh, flag ain't right. I was 16 when I first traveled down that long and lonely road. Years later, it would always be the only one I know. See the blues when it took me by the hand, it showed me I couldn't hide. Blues when it took me by the heart, it will never be denied. Flag ain't right. Flag ain't right. Willie Foster took me to Greenville and he showed me the old ways. Took me down to the crossroads and back again. I will never be able to pay. See the blues when it took me by the hand, showed me that I could run or hide. It's the blues when it took me by my heart, they will never be denied. Flag ain't right. Flag ain't right.